We're now up to Daf Memches Omid Beis. The Mishnah says, Lo Yeshev B'tzila. Don't sit under the shadow of an Asherah tree because you're benefiting from the Asherah. We'll see exactly where he's sitting, which shadow. V'im Yashav, and if he went ahead and he violated this and he sat under the tree, nevertheless talk, because he sat under the shadow of the tree. Let's explain. Let's say the foliage of the tree extends for 4 amos, but the shade of the tree goes beyond the 4 amos. So he sat under the shade of the tree beyond the 4 amos, and therefore he's not in the oel of the Asherah tree. The oel of the Asherah tree, meaning the roof on top, has the status of an oel ames, zivche mesiv, and anyone that's underneath that foliage therefore becomes tameh. But in this case, he sat underneath the shade that was beyond the foliage, so he was not underneath the foliage. And that's called sel d'tzel. V'lo yaver tachtea, but you're not allowed to go underneath the foliage of the tree. And if you do pass through the foliage of under the foliage of the tree, you're tameh, because that's oil. Hoisa goes zealous as a rabbin, but if, let's say, the idol worshiper had made an Asherah tree right in the middle of the public thoroughfare, and he's taking away the ability of the public to walk there, which is called Gozel Sarabim, then V'yover Tachtei Tor. Even if he goes underneath the roof of the Asherah tree, he's Tor. Mishnah says, Lo Yeshev B'tzila Pshita. Obviously, you're not allowed to benefit from Avoda Zara, so he's not allowed to sit under the shade of the foliage. He's not sitting under the foliage. That for sure would be asur, and it would be tameh. But rather, he sits in the shade that is projected by the tree beyond the height of the. That didn't make sense. Not beyond the height of, but if we draw a straight line down from the height of the foliage on the most extreme extended side, the shade beyond that is where he sat. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, Michlal de Betzel Komosim Yoshav Tomei. Are you telling me that if, on the other hand, he sits in the shadow of the height of the tree, he will become Tomei? Okay, so now we have to figure out what's the Tzel Komosa. The shadow of its height. He says the following. In the early morning and the late afternoon, when the sun is low over the horizon, the shadow of an object is longer than the height of the object itself. is really interesting because you're talking about a shadow that extends beyond the height, meaning let's say he's 5 foot tall, the shadow goes 6 feet. The portion of the shadow that extends beyond the area corresponding to the object's height is called sila, the shadow of its shadow. In contrast, to what's it called, the tsel komasa, sela de tsela, the shadow of its shadow, right beyond the height. Again, we're talking about two different dimensions. We're using height as a measurement for, let's call it, width or extension. So basically, if I understand correctly, there are three segments to the shadow. There's the shadow directly under the foliage, and then for sure he's tameh because that's an oil, because it's an Asherah tree. Then there's a shadow that extends beyond the shadow. I'm sorry, beyond the foliage, but it's not yet Sela de Tsela, but rather it's Tsel Komasa. So let's say the tree, I don't know, it's 20 amos high. The foliage extends for 5 amos. So the shadow that is projected by the tree past the 5 amos, but within the 20 amos, that's called Tsel Komasa. Then we have the third category of the shadow, it's called Tsela de Tsela, and that's the extension of the tsel during certain times of the day beyond the height of the tree itself. Now, if the Mishnah, in prohibiting sitting under the tsel, is not pshita, but it's coming to tell me a chiddush, and that chiddush is that you're not allowed to sit even in that third category of tzila de tzila, shadow of the shadow, then you're telling me that that's the case where you're not allowed to sit there and enjoy the benefit of the shadow, but you're not tameh. Well, why not tell me a bigger chiddush? That if you sit beyond the extension of the foliage, in the tsel komasa, then you're not tameh. The answer is apparently the Mishnah is implying that you are tameh. And the Gemara rejects this. The Gemara says you're only tameh if you sit under the foliage, but not beyond the foliage, even though it's within the tsel komasa. So the Gemara says, lo, afilu tsel komasa nami yoshev tar, because if he's not sitting under the foliage, then he's not benefiting from the Asherah tree, but rather from its shadow, and therefore he's tar. But the Mishnah wants to tell me something about tsel tsela, that you're not allowed to sit in the tsel tsela because you're still benefiting from the tsel that is projected by the Asherah tree. So the bottom line is that the only time that you are tameh is if you walk underneath the tree itself, meaning underneath the foliage. If you walk beyond the foliage, whether it's tsel komasa, and how much more so if it's tsela de tsela, you're tar. If you want to know what you're allowed and where you're allowed to sit, the answer is you can't sit anywhere that you benefit from the shade, even the extreme third category called tsela de tsela. Ika de masli la seifa. So now we have a Lishna Basra, where the entire Shaklavitari that we just learned is going on the Seif of the Mishnah. It says Im Yoshav Tohar. If he sits in the shadow of the Asherah, he's Tohar, so he's not beneath the roof, the oil. Pshita. Obviously, if he's not beneath the oil, then why should we even guess that he might be Tomei? You're talking about Tzel Komasa, the middle category, what we call the 20 amo in our case, where it's still, the shade still is less than the height of the tree itself. And you might think in that case that you're Tomei. Kamashma, the Mishnah says, no, you're Tar. Michlal, the Tzela, Filu Chatchilu Yeshen. If the Mishnah is telling me you're not allowed to benefit from Tzel Komasa, but you remain Tar if you did, then it's implying that Tzela is mutter. Even L'chatchila, he can sit there. And that's not true. Because Tzela, although it's the most extended and most far removed from the Asherah tree itself, but nevertheless it's a shade that he's benefiting from the Asherah tree. Lo, the Gemara says. The reason why the Mishnah is talking about Tzel Komasa is Kamashmon Dafilu V'Tzel Komasim Yoshev Tar. It's only telling me a din in Tara. It's not focused on where you're allowed and where you're not allowed. You're not allowed even V'Tzela, the shadow of the shadow, because he's still benefiting from the Asherah tree. Now the Mishnah says, Lo Yavor Tachteh Avim Ovar Tomei, my timer. I'm not exactly sure what this my timer here is about. Unfortunately, I don't find any comments here. Maybe you have a comment in your Gemara. What is my timer? What do you mean my timer? The Asherah was worshipped. Apparently, we're talking about, again, I'm afraid to say this, about an Asherah tree that was not worshipped. So therefore, the Gemara answers, the reason why the Asherah tree and its foliage becomes an oil and he's tameh if he passes underneath it, is not because of the Asherah tree itself, but because the idol worshippers will bury their tikroves avodas kochavim underneath the tree. So again, I don't know enough about the idol worshippers to explain this. But what I understand here, a sociological statement that if they call this tree an Asherah tree, what the idol worshippers meant to say about that is not that they worship the tree, but that whatever they had to bring as a sacrifice, which is called in the Gemara's language tikroves, and I guess, they brought the meat back from the tikroves and they would bury it at the foot of the tree, something along that line. The Gemara says, Mani Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira he, Desani Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer, Minayin l'tikroves avodas kocham shemetamis ba'oel. That means that these tikroves, these offerings, are metami ba'oel. So again, let's understand oil here. If he walks under the foliage of the tree, then he and the tikroves, which is buried at the bottom of the tree, are underneath the same roof. So that's like walking into an oil and there's a mace in the oil. You and the mess and the corpse are in the same oil, and therefore you're tummy. Shenemar, in the Parsha Bal Pa'or, it says, Vayitzemdu lebal Pa'or vayochlu zivchei mesim. So there's a tzushtel here between the tikroves avodas kochavim and mesim. Ma mes mitami b'oel, after tikroves avodas kochavim mitami b'oel. Hoise gozel sarab v'over tachtei tor, iboilahu ovar or over. Is he allowed l'chatchila to walk there? Because since the Asherah was ma'akev the rabbim, it's in a public area, therefore it doesn't have the status of an Asherah tree to generate an Isur. If you hold over means you're allowed l'chatchila to walk beneath it. And this is because apparently this whole derivation of Zivchei Mesim is only an Asmachta Derabanan, and the Rabbanan said, under the following circumstances, where they're stealing from the public thoroughfare, it's not Mitame. Over, meaning even l'chatchila you're allowed to walk underneath this tree that robs the rabbin. Rabbi Yochanan says that the Mishnah is only telling me that if you walked under it, then you're not makabel tumah, but you're not allowed to go there l'chatchila. You're still, getting close to, you're rubbing shoulders, so to speak, with the Avoda Zara. V'lo pligi, they don't argue. It all depends on whether or not there are other options in terms of the highways and the roads to get to your destination. If there's no way you can get to your destination other than that, than passing under this asher tree that steals from the rabbin, then you're allowed even l'chatchila. If, on the other hand, you can take a left turn and find your way through another circuitous route to get to your destination, then you have to do so. If you didn't do so, then you're not tamei. Amalei Rav Sheshes l'shamei ki motis lahosam ar hitni. There's a public asherah, and we're going to have to walk under it. Well, the Gemara is going to vacillate about that, but anyway, if we walk under it, hurry me through it. Like maybe he was the gola, the balagola. What's the case? If there's no other way to go to get to your destination, then why is he rushing through it? He's allowed to go there l'chatchila. Mishri Shor. If he has another road, then he's not allowed to go there. Is Kiyomar hit the Mishari? Just because you're hurrying through it, therefore it's mutter? Kumar answers, it's really mutter. Why did he ask the Shammai to hurry him through? Adam Chashiv Shain, Rav Sheshes was on a high level, and his standards are more stringent than the regular standards for everybody else, and therefore he didn't want to have any exposure to an Asherah tree. Hurry me through it. I have to go through, but hurry me through. The Mishnah says, Zorin tachtel yerokos b'mosach shovim avolo b'mosach chama. When you plant vegetables underneath an Asherah tree, you have to ask yourself the question whether or not there's a benefit derived from the fact that these vegetables are underneath the shade of the Asherah tree. So during the winter months, the Asherah tree does absolutely nothing for the vegetables. But during the summer months, when the vegetables are exposed to the hot sun, and therefore they might dry up and wither away, then for sure you're benefiting from the Asherah tree and its shade. Rashi adds here that in the wintertime, the tree is harmful to the vegetables growing beneath it because it blocks the little sunlight that they are able to get in the winter. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Af lo yirokos b'mos ha'geshamim, mipnei she'hanevoya nosheres aleim. So Rabbi Yossi says that, there's a totally different issue here but in planting vegetables at the foot of an Asherah tree during the winter, and that is fertilizing. The leaves from the Asherah tree fall in the winter, and they combine with the soil, and the leaves and the soil together, hovelehem zevel, they become fertilizer. So by planting underneath the Asherah tree, even in the wintertime, okay, you're not benefiting from the shade, because Adarabah, you need more to maximize the sunlight you can get in the wintertime, but the vegetables will benefit from the Asherah tree because the leaves that fall from the Asher tree and mix and get they dissolve, disintegrate. That was the word I wanted. They disintegrate into the soil, and that enhances the productivity of the soil. Gemara says, Wait a minute. The leaves themselves are not fertilized. It's only the leaves together with the soil, and the soil itself is mutter. The leaves is also because it came from an Asherah tree, so it's zev gorim. And now we're saying that according to Rav Yossi, zev gorim is also the Rabbanan who allow it, b'mos hagshamim. Amri, they hold zev gorim mutter. Ha'ifcha shaminale. We have the opposite. Disnan, we learned in the Mishnah. Okay, it was back on Daf Mem Gimel. Rav Yossi Omer. Shochek, when you take the idol and you grind it up to destroy it. Zara l'ruach, you scatter it into the wind. Batel yam, throw it into the sea. Amru lo, I don't get it. You're throwing it into the wind? Chachamim say you can't do that. Afhi nasa zevel. The ground up dust of the idol will fertilize your field, so you're benefiting from the idol. V'nemar, and the Torah says, that you have to stay far and far away from Avoda Zara. So it turns out that the Rabbanan are holding Zev Gorim is awesome. Rav Yossi is saying Zev Gorim is mutter. That's the exact opposite of what we see here in our Mishnah. Kasha the Rabbanan, Kasha the Rav Yossi, the Rav Yossi. I can reconcile the two statements of Rabbi Yossi. Hasam de ka'azali ibud matir. Rabbi Yossi, in the case of the shochek v'zora l'ruach, he's preoccupied with destroying Avodah Zarah. And if he's preoccupied with destroying Avodah Zarah, we don't have a chashash that maybe by mistake he'll benefit from the Avodah Zarah, and instead of pulverizing it, he might use it for something. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi is matir. But in a normal case like our case, where he's not preoccupied with destroying the idol, lo kazal ibud, also. Then in our Mishnah's case, when the leaves from the Asherah tree fall into the soil, and the leaves now create a fertilizer and he's benefiting from the leaves, then it's awesome. But Rabbanan Kasha, we still are remaining with the outstanding contradiction between the Rabbanan and the Rabbanan. The Gemara says, Ipo. You know what? Let's change around the names. So what does it mean, Epuch? So it says in Rashi, Rabbi Yossi is going to allow one to plant vegetables under the Asherah tree in the winter, even though the leaves will be one element in generating fertilizer, because Zevazeh Garim is mutter. And Memela, I understand why he holds Zora, Shochek v'Zora L'ru. The Rabbanan, on the other hand, they hold that Zevazeh Garim is awesome. And therefore they're going to prohibit, even in the winter, planting vegetables under the Asherah. And that's very consistent with their opinion that you're not allowed to throw the dust of the pulverized idol into the air because it could become a fertilizer. Ibai Sema, the Gemara says, low table. I don't have to go this radical, extreme way of saying low table. To Rabbi Yossi, the original contradiction, Rabbi Yossi, Kiddushaninon, we go back to the answer that we gave before, that when it's le'ibud, and he's preoccupied with destroying it, we don't have a chash that'll benefit from it. Rabbanon, Kida Omer, Rav Mori, Braid, Rav Kana. Masha mashbiach ba'or poge b'basar. Okay, we'll see that's an analogy to another din, which has to do with Psuli HaMikdashim, but Hacha nami here too. Masha mashbiach b'nevaya poge b'tzel. So although you're right that there is an immediate benefit from the leaves, and therefore we should have prohibited planting the vegetables at the foot of the Asherah tree during the winter. But overall, financially, there's a loss because there's a hefsed that counters the benefit. The benefit is the fertilizer, but that benefit is neutralized by the negative. What's the negative? And that is the shade, because as we said before, during the winter months, the shade of the Asherah tree will damage by blocking out the little light that the vegetables need from the little limited amount of sunlight in the winter. Now, what's the original case of Rav Kahana, of Rav Mori, I mean? That is mashmash biach bi'or pogem b'basar. Okay, so this means that in Psuli HaMukdashim, right, you're not allowed to, even though it's not royal mizbeach, but there's still an Isur Gizav Avoda, there's still residue kodesh in the Psuli HaMukdashim, and the Brisa says that you cannot flay, okay, flay is hafshatas ha'or, of this Psuli HaMukdashim. Again, if you do it in a certain way, because if the animals were flayed in this fashion, that was done in order to keep the hide intact, but the meat was damaged in the process. Okay, so this you have to know more about, butchers and stuff like that. He says he's afraid of cutting the hide, so the butcher makes extra incisions in the meat, which is detrimental to the meat. So since the animal is still sacred to some degree, it has a shirayim of kedusha, its meat should not be treated in this disrespectful manner. So therefore, you're not allowed to flay it from its feet in that way. Frek the Gemara, we'll just try to see what we can get done in 2 minutes here. The Savar Rabbi Yossi Zeves Gorim Aser. Are you telling me that Rabbi Yossi's worried about the leaves in the wintertime that fall from the Asherah tree onto the vegetables and the soil and mix together to create fertilizer? Therefore, he's benefiting from Avoda Zara. Zeves Gorim Aser. V'atanan, what about the Mishnah in Orla? Rabbi Yossi Omer notim yichur shel orla v'yein notim egos shel orla mipnei shehu peri. V'ye Omer Rabbi Yehuda Marav moder Rabbi Yossi shem nota v'hivrich v'hirkiv muter. So again, the Mishnah is telling you that you can plant a branch of an orla tree, and the reason why you're allowed to plant the branch of an orla tree is because the fruits of the tree are also, but not the tree itself. So the bark or the branch of the tree is not also. But let's say you have a nut from an orla tree, that's already a peri. So you want to plant that nut in the ground so it grows a tree, you're not allowed to do that. However, Rabbi Yossi, who is the one who prohibits planting the egos because the peri, he's modeh that in the case where he took the nut and he planted the nut, then, which is called nota, hivrich vehirkiv muter. The fruit that grows as a result is permitted immediately because it receives nutrition not only from the original tree, the orla, but also from the tree into which it's grafted. So he grafted from the orla tree, and then the fruit of that grafted orla tree, that tree that was grafted onto the orla tree, is zevazeh goren, because he grafted it from a tree that's not orla. And therefore the fruits that grow after the grafting are mutter. So the Gemara is now asking a stira. Our Mishnah assumes in the case where the leaves fall down from the Asher tree, that Zevezeh Gorem is awesome. But here we see in the Mishnah in Orla, that Rabbi Yossi goes on record as saying Zevezeh Gorem is mutter. Tanya Rami Hachi, Mod Rabbi Yossi, Shem Nata, Vehivrich, Vehirkiv, mutter. Right? If he plants the nut and then he grafts it onto another Orla, a non-Orla tree, then it's mutter. Why? Because Zevezeh Gorem is mutter. Okay, this is where we'll stop for today. And what's tomorrow? It's Wednesday. Very good. Have a great day. Thanks.